So I'm part of cohort 13, and I have been living in Latin America for the past like 2.5, almost 3 years now. First in Chile for 2 years, and then now I'm here in Peru, in the Sacred Valley just outside of Cusco. And yeah, I got my start in business-to-business tech marketing. I'll actually kind of go into this in a little bit more detail, but effectively, what I'm here to talk about is something called strategic narrative, which I will explain is storytelling, but really kind of goes beyond storytelling, or the way that we understand storytelling might be a little bit different than at least in the way that I have come to understand it. So super excited to really get into it and share a case study of a business-to-business marketing consultant who basically used this technique in order to really scale, to grow beyond just a solo consultant, and to scale into a large agency. And so I think that there's some really, really powerful techniques that we consultants can basically use to sell our expertise. So I guess without further ado, I will just jump into my PowerPoint presentation. Basically going to walk you guys through that case study. It'll be about 25, maybe 30 minutes, depends on how long I blather on for. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end to, just kind of discuss and answer any questions you guys might have. So let me go ahead and do that now. Just give me a quick second. To set up my slideshow. I'll just do my entire screen. Okay. You guys should see my screen. Can you confirm?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, cool. Ignite radical behavior change at scale. Sipping my mate de coca. All right, guys. So just a little bit more of an introduction as to who I am. When I was a little kid, I wanted to dedicate my life to storytelling because I was super, super obsessed. I wanted to be a video game writer, actually. And so I thought of it as a failure when I ended up in business-to-business marketing by accident after I graduated college. But to my delight, I discovered that storytelling is actually a very big deal in B2B tech. So I decided that I was going to dedicate my career to mastering something called strategic narrative, of which we will be learning today. And since then, have worked with over 20 clients and been able to drive some pretty transformative results with this storytelling technique. And so in order to teach you folks how to do the same, one of the best case studies for strategic narrative, at least in recent years in the world of business-to-business marketing, is this guy named Chris Walker. So effectively, this guy got, he had some like different ideas about how to do marketing when he was working at a medical device company. He got fired because they didn't really align with the ideas that the company wanted to do. And so he decided to set off as a solo consultant with his own sort of, philosophy for how to do marketing. And, effectively that philosophy is what drove his whole storytelling, which then allowed him to create an agency called Refine Labs, which has generated 22 million or so in annual revenue. So strategic narrative is the powerful technique by which he really crystallized that unique philosophy that he had, and then was able to communicate it in such a way that it really inspired people and kind of created this whole movement. He's since become like one of the top voices in business to business go to market more broadly. So to get started, I want to first walk you folks through 4 fundamental premises behind my whole philosophy with strategic narrative. So first, winning in business to business, or really like any vertical, anything in business, requires strategy and execution. Second, good execution is being commoditized by AI. We are already at the point where you can look at Y Combinator on YouTube talking casually about how vertical AI agents are going to replace entire teams and functions at enterprises. These conversations are just happening very casually out in the open, right? That's the point that we're at. Another kind of point to sort of demonstrate where we're at is there's this tool called Replit. I don't know if you guys have played around with it, but effectively, you don't really need a developer to code to build a SaaS platform now. You can actually just use natural language inputs with this app in order to actually create programming, which is sort of crazy because my dad, who's a baby boomer, this guy is not tech savvy at all, is literally building his own software to help time the stock market. So, to what degree that's going to be successful, I don't really know, but that's the point we're at right now. I'm just like blown my mind that, my dad is now building software. And the same dynamic is happening in the marketing space, right? Like when we want to produce marketing content, we're fast moving towards the world where we'll be able to just basically have a conversation with an AI agent, and then it will be able to take our ideas and use it to produce like actually well-produced marketing content across a variety of different formats and channels. So AI commoditizing execution, that brings us to the third premise, which is that therefore strategy will determine our success or failure. Now, I believe that everyone in business needs strategic thinking, but that this is something that is especially important for those of us in consulting, because we have to guide our clients through a lot of complexity, oftentimes things that they don't really understand that well, right? And it can be the case, right? I mean, if you're working with startups, no, but if you're working with bigger companies, you oftentimes have to get like a bunch of different people who care about different things all moving in the same direction, which can be, kind of difficult, especially again, if these people don't really understand what it is that we're talking about. So how might we then master strategic thinking? Well, what I'm going to talk to you folks about today is how we can use story to do that. Story is actually the best tool that we have available to master strategic thinking. And the reason for that is because story and strategy are literally the same thing. Let me explain. Both stories and strategies, again, the same thing, are things that happen inside of our brains that direct our behavior towards a desired outcome. Consider this quote from the venture capitalist Ben Horowitz. He basically said, story is not marketing. Story is the strategy. Company story is company strategy. You can have a great product, but a compelling story puts the company into motion. And this I've found to basically be the case, because when you look at the 5 questions that you must answer in order to form a strategy, that's what is happening, what does it mean, what should I do, how do I take action, and what is the desired result, that lines up perfectly with a 5-act story structure, which is pretty much a universal story structure. Excuse me. And that goes, something happens, which sets off a crisis that forces the protagonist to do something, which requires them to overcome obstacles to experience a desired result. Couple examples. Slow and steady wins the race. That is a strategy. I'm not sure if you guys have this fable in Spanish, but definitely this one. So be trustworthy, right? And the boy who cried wolf, or el niño que gritó ahí viene el lobo, right? Like, be trustworthy, don't lie. Otherwise, people aren't going to come when you start crying wolf, right? That's a strategy. Even the little origin story that I told you kind of had a strategy in it. Might be a little bit more up for interpretation, but stories and strategies are literally the same thing. That's the big idea here. This is the big idea that unlocks strategic narrative, right? That these things, when you abstract them as cognitive processes, that's processes that happen inside of our brains, they are literally the same thing. And the reason that we care about that is because story/strategy really isn't that well understood, which means that it is a massive competitive advantage for anybody who can understand it. which is why my goal today is to help you folks understand. So that way, just as we're about to see with Chris Walker, we can position our consultancies, position ourselves as strategic experts, strategic advisors, non-commoditized service providers. We can create awesome content. We become thought leaders, and we can win clients, and honestly, probably a lot more. Now, funny little note, given the nature of strategic narrative, or the fact that I've basically reconstructed the Refined Labs narrative, it's going to kind of seem like I'm selling Refined Labs, but I have no affiliation with them. The reason I put this slide in here is kind of funny because after giving this presentation to a couple different groups, some folks have reached out to me for help with demand generation, just because I guess they were convinced that, you know, I was the storyteller and whatever. So I don't know, maybe that's really just kind of goes to show you how powerful this technique can be. But yeah, basically I do strategic narrative, Chris Walker and company do demand generation and go-to-market efficiency and all that kind of stuff. So anyways, without further ado, we're going to get into how to sell your unique consulting expertise with strategic narrative. In order to do that, we're going to start by first going through a super quick high-level summary of the Refined Labs narrative, just a super high-level outline. Then I'm going to go back and explain how the 5-act structure works, looking at that outline, before then jumping into a more detailed reconstruction of the Refined Labs narrative, before then extracting some key lessons for us consultants using some more smaller case studies. All right, here's the summary. Business-to-business buying behavior has shifted from desktop search to mobile social. This happened back in like 2017 or so, which is why marketers stuck on the old methodology are failing. And so marketers need to shift from lead generation to demand generation, which requires a new mindset, a new methodology for measuring success, and a new execution with different tactics on different channels. The result is a completely transformed go-to-market with lower acquisition cost, higher ROI, and lots of marketing source pipeline. Okay, let's break it down. So in that first act, there's the paradigm shift from desktop search to mobile social, which then sets in motion Act 2, the crisis, where effectively marketers are failing. This is what I call an unacceptable consequence, right? So your paradigm shift is going to set in motion a sequence of events that's going to bring your prospects to an unacceptable consequence. This is where all the urgency of your sales pitch is going to come from. This is basically, okay, I need to change. I need to leave the old status quo way of thinking behind. With that urgency that we've created, that then sets us up to talk about the mission or the new winning strategy that they must adopt to overcome the crisis. In the case of the Refined Labs narrative, that's shifting from lead generation to demand generation. I'll explain this a little bit more in detail shortly. Now, once people have adopted the mission, they're great, they're inspired, right? But the problem with adopting a new winning strategy is that it's really difficult. There's a lot of obstacles that might stand in the way, right? So in order to overcome those obstacles, we need to then teach them, or we need to empower them with an action plan. So this is usually a company's products, or it could be your services or your unique, implementation plan, or even the pillars of your content strategy, right? But effectively, the idea here is that we are teaching and empowering our clients to adopt the new winning strategy so that way they can overcome the crisis. Now, once we have taught them this, that'll then bring us to the 5th act, which I call vision. The idea is to end on a desired result or make people feel in their bodies that success has already happened. This is where we provide proof. And if you have a super inspiring vision statement, like Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech, it would go here too. So that's kind of the high level summary. And if you go through this 5-act structure, the end result, if we really do a good job of telling coherent narratives using this structure, is that folks will understand what you're saying. even if it's super, super complex, if we can reduce it down to a coherent 5-act narrative that's setup, crisis, mission, action plan, and vision, people will understand what we're saying, not just on an intellectual level, but on an emotional level, which is what is required in order to inspire them to leave behind their old, status quo behavior and adopt a new winning strategy. What's required to inspire action, right? Now, before the more detailed readouts of the Refined Labs narrative, I want you folks to understand something super, super important about story. I'm going to take a sip of my coca. I really enjoy the flavor. Right. So story taps into our basic survival instincts. We have the most ancient part of our brain, that's the brainstem, they call it the reptilian brain, is responsible for our survival instincts, which gives us the directive of seek pleasure and avoid pain. Every single decision that we make is basically driven by this part of the brain, by this directive of seek pleasure, avoid pain, right? We have the mammalian brain, which gives us a ton of emotions built on top of that. We have the primate brain and the prefrontal cortex, which give us abstract reasoning and all that kind of stuff. So, it seems like it's really, not so simple, but in fact, deep down, it really is, right? Every human decision is motivated by this directive, right? And stories operate on the same axis. So the y-axis that you see here is that pain versus pleasure polarity, where the x-axis is time. And you can basically graph a story, over the course of, the narrative, based on the emotions of a given, they call it a story beat, or think of it as a plot point, or think of it, it could be like a slide in your PowerPoint presentation, right? Generally speaking, when we see movies in Hollywood, they basically follow this exact structure, right? It's a lot more complex. You're going to see a lot more up and downs in any given act, but they normally follow this structure of there's a big down in, moving from the first act to the second act at the end of the crisis, right? So there's a bunch of psychological tension that is going to be created. And then that psychological tension is going to be resolved about halfway through the movie or at the end of our third act, the mission. That's where we've introduced this new winning strategy to overcome this big strategic level problem that we presented in the second act, right? Now, people are all good and inspired. Now we're going to start to introduce the objections that our prospects might have to whatever it is that we're selling. These are the obstacles that stand in the way of adopting this new winning strategy. Bring the emotions crashing down in this all is lost moment. You can think of in Star Wars when Darth Vader killed Obi-Wan Kenobi, or, I always think the Team America example is my favorite, but I'm not going to explain that one. And then, what that effectively sets you up to do is to then bring the emotions back up to then introduce your solution as a means for overcoming those obstacles. And then, you have your value proposition. So you have the plan that you're giving your clients, the process that you walk them through, whatever it is. And then that ultimately brings you to the desired results you can talk about in the vision using your case studies and all that kind of stuff. So let's take a look at how Chris Walker did it with his narrative. First, Act 1, setup. We're going to capture attention with the paradigm shift. The paradigm shift is a key moment in every story. He starts by saying that back in the early 2010s, MarTech and AdTech vendors created the idea of predictable revenue marketing, where it seemed like you could track everything. Remember way back then, it seemed like you could track everything. Google ads and yada, yada, Google Analytics, whatever. This worked great when buying processes still happen on desktop search and company blogs, where companies let you see what prospects were, where cookies let you see what prospects were doing, because you could then drive them to an ebook landing page, collect their info, nurture them with a bit of email. This is the whole lead generation philosophy. And then have SDRs or sales development representatives. These are generally speaking the young kids who are on the phone making cold calls and stuff. Convert them into sales qualified opportunities. But as Gary Vaynerchuk once said, marketers ruin everything. The success of inbound marketing, so that was this idea that HubSpot created to create, blog content that ranks in the search engines or whatever, flooded Google with low quality content written by junior marketers, which meant that buyers began to see search engines as a bad place to get information. Most demographics at this point were addicted to their smartphones and had adopted social media by then. So content consumption shifted from desktop search to mobile social. All right, so we did a bunch of setup talking about some changes in the larger business-to-business marketing industry, and that then led us to a paradigm shift moment, that shift from desktop search to mobile social. Paradigm shift is super important because this is a thing that it needs to be something that our prospects can kind of like relate to and kind of immediately recognize is true. We want it to be a change that is consequential, right? That's then going to set in motion our second act, which is the crisis. This is where we are going to impel a sense of urgency by bringing prospects to an unacceptable consequence. Chris does this by saying that when business-to-business content consumption shifts to mobile social, where you can't use cookies, your cookies don't track on the Facebook newsfeed or on LinkedIn or whatever, that renders the lead generation model ineffective. Many companies try to adapt by using paid ads on social to drive gated content downloads. So, you drive to a landing page and there's like seven B2B marketing strategies in 2010 or whatever it is, right? You download the ebook. But the problem is that buyers don't even read the content. They forget they downloaded it. And then when the SDR finally connects with them, they have no idea what your company does, nor the problem that you solve. That means that even if the SDR converts them to an opportunity, now the account executive, that's the person that closes the deals, has to do a bunch of educating, which increases the sales cycle and ultimately converts at a low clip. So now we're spending all this money on paid ads, software, and headcount to generate very low converting leads. And the only way to scale is to pour more money into this very inefficient system, which Chris calls the MQL hamster wheel, which still often results in missed revenue targets, which marketing gets blamed for, which perhaps has something to do with why CMOs have the shortest tenure in the C-suite. Ouch. So the paradigm shift bridges us from the first act to the second act. It sets in motion a bunch of consequences that ultimately result in an unacceptable consequence. The unacceptable consequence here is that marketers, that there's missed revenue targets, they get blamed for it, and then they get fired. So if we're pitching to marketers, that's the oh no moment, I really need to make a change, right? Super, super important, right? When we have a paradigm shift, it must lead us to an unacceptable consequence for the prospects that we are pitching. Otherwise, they're not going to have any urgency. Now, once they do have urgency, we can shift the emotions into the positive and inspire transformation by articulating a new winning strategy they can use to overcome the crisis. Chris says, the old model of lead generation, the MQL hamster wheel, makes 0 sense. We need to stop spending all of our money generating low quality leads and instead educate our ICP, ideal customer profile buyers, with good content on the channels they are actually using. Which is to say that we need to shift from lead generation to demand generation. So that unacceptable consequence, oh no, I need to do something, right? We've just created a bunch of psychological narrative tension, right? Now we need to resolve that tension and inspire people, give them a way out of the crisis by giving them a winning strategy, which in this case is lead generation to demand generation. But as I mentioned before, adopting a winning strategy, just changing in general is really, really hard. People don't really like to change, right? So we want to empower them to adopt your strategy with your solution, your consulting, proprietary process, whatever it is. Now I mentioned that kind of all is lost moment. Here it is. You can't just immediately switch over to this new strategy because boards and executives have been indoctrinated by the lead gen predictable revenue marketing model. Ad tech vendors sold this idea for years and years and years and basically indoctrinated executives and boards with how to look at go-to-market and marketing that really wasn't aligned with how the way it actually works. Now, they're going to see anything that doesn't show up with trackable attribution to a lead conversion as a waste of money and shut you down. So all that stuff you're doing on social media, well, we can't really track it. Where's all the leads, right? So we're just going to shut you down, right? Even though that stuff actually is what works in today's day and age. So the result of this was that Chris got fired at his last in-house role for trying to do something that really just didn't have the infrastructure to do, which led him to set off, excuse me, as a solo consultant and soon after start Refine Labs, a business-to-business demand generation agency that helps marketers drive pipeline efficiency, boost revenue, and improve marketing ROI. They offer a whole suite of services ranging from executive level consulting down to tactical execution with content creation, media buying, program management, and more. Excuse me. Chris also puts out tons of great content to help marketers shift from lead gen to demand gen, focusing on three main pillars. First is mindset. To adopt demand gen, we need to think less short-term, more long-term. Less about direct response and more about brand. Less about capturing people's information and more about educating them directly in social feeds without making them click off. That's where people are consuming content, right? Second is measurement, where he introduces new methodologies for measuring success, such as self-reported attribution and high-intent revenue opportunities. Just some of his proprietary measurement stuff. And third is execution, which is where he talks about podcasts, videos, and organic social content optimized for in-feed consumption. People are on social, so let's put content on social, even though we can't measure it. All of these together add up to a marketing strategy optimized for dark social, where buyers can share your content on LinkedIn, on Reddit, on Slack channels, and other digital word-of-mouth channels that buyers actually use. Now, I mentioned that the really, really cool thing that Chris Walker does that you don't see in a ton of tech industry strategic narratives, which I think is a missed opportunity, is where he has that all is lost moment, where effectively this is where like the major objections to the strategy that you're pitching would go, right? You want to say, hey, look, this strategy that sounds like an amazing winning strategy is really hard to do. That sounds like it's going to help you overcome the crisis. It's really, really hard to do, because that then sets you up to offer your solution as a solution to those obstacles that stand in the way of adopting the strategy. So that's what we just did. Now, the end of the fourth act brings us to the fifth act, where we're going to close our narrative by helping customers embody success. We want people to feel a little taste of what success is going to feel like, because that feeling is going to drive their behavior in the direction we want it to go. After adopting demand generation, marketers will begin to drive high intent conversions, i.e. demo requests, where prospects arrive to sales meetings already educated and ready to buy, which increases win rates, lowers sales cycle, results in lower acquisition cost, higher marketing ROI, and hit revenue targets, as well as happy boards, executives, and sales teams. So instead of getting blamed and possibly fired, marketing now looks like a hero. So this is kind of closing the loop from that unacceptable consequence moment at the end of the second act, right? Marketing is getting fired at the end of the second act, but like, nope, we're going to turn that around. Now marketing's a hero, right? So we're closing the loop. Stories go in circles. Like I said, easiest way to do this, the most common way to do this is just with proof points, testimonials, case studies, all of that kind of good stuff. Just proof that what we're talking about can actually come true, and a little bit of fear of missing out if we can invoke that. And then also, I think that this is really powerful. I don't know how applicable it is for consultants, but it could be, is if you have a very inspiring mission, right? Like 5 years down the line after implementing these changes, how will the organization be transformed? The fifth act and the close of your narrative is a really, really good place to put it, just like Martin Luther King did in his famous I Have a Dream speech. So that is the Refine Labs narrative that has brought them to 22 million in annual agency bookings in about 5 years, which is really, really freaking hard to do. Like a marketing agency growing that fast. And really the reason for that was because what Chris Walker did is he would come out on LinkedIn with videos where he's basically just getting on his high horse and really hitting hard the first 3 acts of that narrative, particularly the crisis. And he was able to articulate the crisis so clearly that all the other marketers who were kind of experiencing it but didn't really know how to articulate it were like, whoa, yeah, that makes so much sense, right? So you just saw this guy blow up on LinkedIn, had a whole community of business-to-business marketers who were like, you're right, that strategy, we need to stop doing lead gen, go to demand gen, right? Like it kind of created this whole sort of a movement. And man, we don't necessarily need to do that exact same thing, right? We don't necessarily need to follow that exact same playbook, but what that really shows us is that when you are super clear about your story, your strategy, it can help people really understand like what your value is, and that can just drive your success all across your business. So effectively, it all comes down to just strategic thinking. That's understanding, getting super, super clear around what is happening to your clients, to your prospects. What does it mean in terms of their survival? I'll articulate this. How does this map to the crisis? Is that, you know, in any given situation, when something is happening, there's either opportunities or there's risks. And the difference between those two things is what creates narrative tension. So number 2, crisis. What does it mean in terms of our survival? That's important to be clear about. What does it mean in terms of our client survival? What should they do? What's the winning strategy they can adopt? How do they take action on that strategy? How do they overcome the obstacles that stand in the way? And what is the desired result? When we are super clear on those things, it can do a ton for us in our business. And I'm going to show you a couple different examples or case studies for how we consultants can use it in our business. First, positioning our expertise, our unique expertise positioned as a winning strategy. So what I've heard in a lot of conversations, and I'm sure that, you know, the mileage varies here, is that many consultants are viewed as tactical implementers rather than strategic advisors. Again, because of AI coming in, like that's increasingly becoming commoditized, right? And a commodity position is really, really bad for us to be in because it means that we struggle to get paid the rates that we deserve, right? If we're just somebody who fills, you know, an email marketing service, for instance, right? They can easily switch us out for somebody else who does email marketing. The answer to this is kind of what we saw with Chris Walker, where he positioned himself as a strategic expert by challenging the lead generation paradigm. You don't necessarily have to take a controversial position, right? But effectively what we want to do is clearly articulate the client's problem and offer them a strategic solution. So instead of just an email marketing provider, I help people, you know, set up, clear customer journeys that allow you to generate trust or whatever. So this journey of trust idea could be something, a thread, a seed of a strategic narrative, I suppose. So here's an example. Imagine you are a fractional CFO specializing in SaaS. You want to be treated less like a glorified bookkeeper and more like a strategic partner. You could do a narrative selling the strategy of growth-aligned financial architecture. It goes like this. SaaS companies face unique cash flow challenges during rapid growth phases, where traditional financial structures designed for stability actually inhibit expansion. This misalignment causes founders to make critical mistakes. Either they underinvest and miss growth opportunities, or overextend and create unsustainable burn rates. The result is either stalled growth or a sudden cash crisis that forces layoffs and erodes investor confidence. That's an unacceptable consequence. We don't want that. What these companies need isn't just financial oversight, but a dynamic, growth-aligned financial architecture specifically designed for SaaS economics that flexes with changing growing stages. I, as a fractional CFO, help my clients implement this by first stabilizing financial reporting to create visibility, then building customized KPI frameworks that align with SaaS metrics, and finally creating scenario-based financial planning systems that anticipate future funding and scaling needs. Companies gain the financial infrastructure of a much larger organization without the full-time C-suite costs, allowing them to make growth decisions with confidence, attract high-quality investors, and create a clear path to their next funding round. So with this narrative, you can put this on like your LinkedIn about page, put a nice little banner, growth-aligned financial architecture. You can put it on your website. You can use it to guide your sales conversations, make a deck, whatever. But the whole idea here is that you stop positioning yourself as a part-time CFO and instead articulate unique perspective on a specific problem for a specific type of client. There's a lot in there. What we're talking about here is positioning, right? Like, what's your unique perspective on a specific problem for a specific type of client, right? So drilling in and finding that crisis, that's the specific problem, right? That is ultimately going to drive the motivation, right? That's all of our work in really finding a target market ultimately, is like finding a market that has a crisis where it's existential enough that they need to make a change, right? Okay, so example number 2 is basically how I have just started to use strategic narrative to generate sales opportunities. So a big problem that I run into is that story and strategy are both very fuzzy. People know that they're important and people kind of have a general sense of what they are, but it's still a little bit difficult for them to understand the value right out of the gate. Let me take a drink here. So given the fact that these two things are very, very fuzzy and people don't really get the value, if I have generic outreach as a strategy consultant, like that's just not really going to work, because I need to prove credibility and immediately help prospects understand what I do, which is really hard to do in a cold outreach channel where they have no idea who I am. It's, it's on their computer, right? It's on like LinkedIn or cold email or whatever. And people's attention spans are so short that they're not going to take the time to actually understand, like, oh, who is this guy? Does he know what he's talking about? Right? Is he, am I willing to like have him consult with me on one of the most strategic things in my business, right? So like, how do we actually get people's attention and actually, pull them into our strategic narrative? Well, what I'm doing to entice folks to take a meeting, or what I need to do is I need to entice folks to take a meeting. I need to convincingly show them value up front and pull them into my strategic narrative without seeming like I'm pitching, right? So I want them, this is a storytelling technique too, but show, don't tell. So I want them to really experience my value without me having to like sell my value, if that makes any sense, right? So what I do, a major component of the crisis of my strategic narrative is that companies struggle to differentiate. There's all this AI copycat products that are now jumping up, right? Or they're selling something very complex. How do they actually differentiate and get folks to understand them? Well, what I do is I generate strategic positioning reports for like a given category. So I'll look at all the different companies in the category, and then I'll put them onto this little matrix that you see over here, where y-axis is, are they positioned on technical features, or are they like a strategic transformation? X-axis is like how differentiated are they, right? So I kind of place every company there. I send the report via email and offer a meeting to review. I also give them opportunities for how they can improve and all that kind of stuff. But effectively what I'm doing is I'm using their own data, their own personalized data, their strategic insights of their specific market in order to really show them my crisis and mission, right? Without seeming like I'm pitching them some idea or something like that, right? I'm actually showing them that like, hey, it's hard to differentiate, right? If you're into it, you got some work that you got to do, but Intuit's massive, so whatever. Anyways, now I've only done like one of these so far, but I've gotten one success and have gotten a 5-figure proposal out for a fintech. And what I kind of noticed was, after having that initial meeting where we discussed the report, I then have workshops, right, to really demonstrate the value. It's just like everything just went so much smoother after that initial meeting. It was almost as if like they immediately kind of saw me as an authority and were convinced that like I was able to solve their problem. So it just completely changed the dynamic, where it wasn't even like I was trying to sell them. It was just like, I'm just trying to help them. And then I just start the process of working with them. And then they're like, oh, how do we continue working together? So that's been a pretty big unlock for me once I've really validated, right? It's just like one opportunity, but we'll see how it goes. So the third thing that I want to show is we can use it to close deals, particularly with a sales deck. So one of my first clients was a startup sales consultancy. It was effectively the SDR manager from a startup I'd worked at. They had a good strategy, but they were just really struggling to get their clients to understand it, which resulted in a low win rate, prospects not engaged. You could see people checking their phones during the sales pitch and all that kind of stuff. So what we did is we went through the process to craft a 5-act strategic narrative, did a bunch of customer interviews to uncover the crisis, which is that startup founders are under tons of pressure from their investors to grow. We created a 5-act narrative as a storybook sales deck. We actually hired a video game illustrator from Square Enix to do this, so it was a lot of fun. And as a result, they tripled their revenue in 2 quarters. And then after like 2 years and rolling out the narrative across their entire go-to-market, had basically grown on every single metric. So it was like immediately transformative. You could see the difference in the prospects as you're going through the sales pitch, that they were actually paying attention and actually engaged. Now, the reason I like showing this case study is because it's not like a mind-blowing strategy, right? He was basically just saying like, have an awesome sales team. You know, we were doing it in a fun way, which is probably what, you know, made it a little bit easier to get a simple message like that across without losing people. But you don't need to be offering some like category changing transformation. You know what I mean? It can be a pretty simple transformation. Now, there's also a ton of other use cases for strategic narrative and 5-act strategic thinking, right? This literally drives everything in your business. You can make blog posts with it. You can do strategy pitches. That's really important for us consultants. I've done a wedding speech with one of these. That was actually like a really fun use case. And then also another use case that you folks might like would be the consulting readouts. If you're, you know, doing a data analysis or whatever, you can definitely use the 5-act structure to create a strategic narrative that will actually inspire clients to really act based on the consulting that you've done. Because one of the most frustrating things for us as consultants is when we create this amazing strategy and then our clients don't use it. Strategic narrative gives us a way to not only inspire our immediate point of contact to use it, but then to also help them inspire everybody else in their company to do the thing too. So it just makes us as consultants way more successful. So one of the most exciting kind of missionary use cases for strategic narrative for me, the thing that really gets me going, is the opportunity to use this to ignite radical behavior change at scale. Because not only will it allow us consultants to clearly position our value to clients, but I also believe it can help us transform the world. I believe that every single human can do this, just like all the great strategic story seers that have come before us. These folks were master strategists, not just amazing people. So to close off, I recently started doing free strategic narrative workshops up to 2 hours, in which basically we will work live to jumpstart your strategic messaging and positioning. I work with startup founders. I also work with consultants as well. Like literally anybody can benefit from this technique, and I just have a ton of fun doing these. So if you folks are interested in this, feel free to shoot me a DM on Slack and we can schedule a time to put something like this in motion. Again, I love working on these, so don't be a stranger. And with that, that's effectively my presentation for today. We're going to open it up to Q&A. If anybody is curious, I also have like a bunch of other examples that we can look at if you're still a little bit unclear, but I figure we'll just kind of start talking now.
Yes, Alfonso, you can go with your question.
Thank you. First of all, really, really great presentation, Ivan. Really, thank you for the information. I think this is going to be really useful in general, but my question here is, how would you apply the 5 steps for generating a successful consultant strategy, like for us that we are part-time consultants in general? So for example, I'm thinking of my LinkedIn content or my, I don't know, my way of reaching out to people, or or things like that? Or do you think there's going to be like a 5 steps for different channels, for example? Or how would you solve that?
Yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, it's kind of like, okay, how do we can use this 5-act structure basically everywhere, right? How do we actually move from like our higher level? Well, I'm kind of answering the question now. So like I would start by ultimately creating the higher level strategic narrative for our clients, right? So normally I do this in the form of a sales deck just because I feel like it's the most actionable and easy way for us to go and test it out, right? But effectively what you want to do is you want to start by understanding your clients and their problem really, really well, right? And then using this 5-act structure to create a sales deck, right? And then you go and you test it out with your clients and you see like, is this actually resonating? Does this actually work, right? Once you actually have that validation and we know that this thing is actually resonating in the market, then we can take that and use it as sort of like a messaging document to then guide the creation of stories all across our business. This can get complex, honestly, because within every large level strategic narrative, there's a ton of smaller strategic narratives too. It's kind of like your business as a whole ecosystem of these narratives. But you can use the same structure to create all of them, right? So once you have that sales deck, you can effectively compress that into the about section on your LinkedIn. You can start to use it to like generate ideas around content that you can create. So generally speaking, your content pillars, just like in Chris Walker's story, that's going to be in the 4th act. That's going to have to do with like the value propositions or the key steps of your narrative. I mean, really, there's different creative ways to do this, but I hope that I'm kind of bringing a little bit more clarity. Let me know.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I can piggyback on that question, Evan, just because I feel like in general, what I'm hearing is very, let's call it easy because it's not easy, but like to execute on a website or a longer format like a deck. Specifically for clients that are just starting out, I would say like their first step is to go to LinkedIn, right? And sometimes obviously like the attention span of people are like pretty short. So how do you prioritize or just piece together these 5 acts? Would you recommend just going, maybe it's setup, then doing a post on crisis? Should we do, I don't know, should we be doing like roasts? For example, if I'm a CRO specialist, should I be like doing roasts for specific websites where I prove the value? What like actionable steps should I be laying out in these posts, for example, if I were to start there?
Yeah. I mean, we can sit here and we can brainstorm a bunch of different ideas. What I saw for Chris Walker, what he did was his specific technique was that he would do these live events where folks would show up basically just to talk about business to business marketing. And he would spend like the first, 20 minutes of an hour-long webinar where he would basically be like going through different elements of the first 3 acts, right? He wouldn't like necessarily do it in all 5 acts like sequentially just like that, right? But he would be telling kind of like the higher level strategic level of the story. He'd have some bullet points that he'd read through. These are things that are pissing me off in the market, blah, 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 whatever, right? And then he would open up to Q&A, which is going to be that 4th act, like the tactical, right? And he's listening to the questions that people are asking, the things that they're struggling with, which then informs his whole content strategy, right? And so what he would then do is he would take the clips from that webinar, and then he would use those as videos that he would post on LinkedIn about like a specific topic that it kind of falls within the narrative, but it doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, right? The important thing is that like, if we really do this strategic narrative thing well, right? This should be something that we really, really know, like a client problem that we're super familiar with, and maybe that we even feel passionate about. That can get us like, we want to put ourselves then in a position where, we can answer questions, we can get on our soapbox and start doing some storytelling. So that's like one specific content strategy that you can use to do this. When it comes to like writing text posts, what I've seen is some folks will like, because you can create like a 2 to 3 sentence elevator pitch from your strategic narrative. Once you have the deck and you're clear around the whole narrative, you can condense it very, very low. What I've seen is like a lot of times you'll like set some context with like a super quick sentence on crisis, right? And then mission to kind of give context to what you're talking about. And then most of your posts is like a how-to overcome this challenge, how to implement a marketing strategy, how to, whatever it might be. So the reality is that because strategic narrative is so complex, there's just like a million different ways that it can be implemented and utilized. But what I would say is the most important is to get super clear on what the narrative is first, because that's then going to drive everything else that you do.
Almost like each one of these steps or combo of these steps become hooks into a larger conversation where,
Exactly.
where you're actually going through a narrative. Okay,
Exactly.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You can go
Go
then.
ahead, Dan.
Can I go now? Thanks.
Yes.
I was careful not to interrupt Gabriel. Okay, so you were telling me, I got a little bit lost at the end, but you're telling us that you hired like a Japanese illustrator, but did you use this resource as a means of marketing, or is that part of the project? I mean, did you use it to generate demand, or is it part of something that you were hired for?
Oh, I was hired to do that. So that wasn't something I did for myself. That was something I did for a client who was a startup sales consultancy.
Okay, so you already had a client. So how? My question is very similar to Gabriel. So we shouldn't use very sophisticated resources when we are like hunting for demand, right?
Like, as in, like, should you hire someone from Square Enix or?
Because right now I'm in the situation that I'm just starting to offer like my hours, something like a fractional COO, and I am having more engagement with narrative without any resources. I don't use illustrations or anything, and I talk about companies having problems. Like operational problems, like being late on delivery, or not selling enough, not meeting sales quota or something. And actually, some people have been following me and messaging me, telling me like their pain points, but it hasn't arrived into a sale yet. I haven't converted those people, right? So I have some followers telling me the problems in their companies, but I cannot find the way to convert them. Like, for example, I can offer them a due diligence or something. How would you recommend for people like me, that I'm in that situation, to start converting these leads?
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying that, like, you're not in a bad place if you're already talking to customers and you're understanding what's going on. Like, that's good if you're already getting conversations, right? Help me understand a little bit more about your customers. What's your ideal customer profile? Like,
my most of my customers, I'm sorry, I'm just turning off this alarm. Most of my customers are people that have not small businesses. I mean, like more than 20 employees. And they have a very operational focus, like I don't know, delivery, food manufacturing, things that are very operational, okay, and or very salesy. I mean, like medium stores, like furniture stores and things that are not corporate, that like mom and pop stores. And their narrative, they always come to me commenting on my TikTok, on my Instagram, like very sad narratives, like I don't have any sales, or like this company from my dad is going underwater, or I don't know, I am between the fences with this sales decision. And I always tell them like to, first of all, make like an RX, like I don't know how to say that, radiografía in English. And but most of them haven't been are not willing to turn into clients yet. I could offer some due diligence, for example, like how long like the sales turnover and operational metrics and things that CEOs normally do, right? But I don't know. I haven't been able to convert them as fast as I want. They always come with problems, but I already know the solution. That is to first look at everything, right, and get a clear diagnostic. But they are not willing to go to that stage.
Yeah. What comes to mind, without a ton of information, but what comes to mind immediately is, rather than jumping straight to the like, okay, I know what to do, we need to do a diagnostic, we need to blah blah blah, right? Like that's kind of like action plan. Instead, we need to like think more high level, right? So first off, if they're coming to us with plans, with pains, we want to like contextualize those within some sort of existential crisis for their business or some sort of unacceptable consequence, and then offer a strategy, something high level, right? That we need to move our organization to be, an efficient organization. I don't know what it is, right? But like you kind of offer them some strategy that will help them overcome that big crisis that they're facing. And then that gives context for, in order to do that, here's the action plan that we can undertake in order to do it. Because people don't buy products, they don't buy services, they don't buy solutions, they don't buy plans or whatever, right? They buy strategies. They buy like ideas and stuff like that. So we have to go high level first to give context for why the thing that we're recommending matters. So my guess is, again, like, I'd have to dig in a lot more, but my guess is you're probably jumping a little bit too quickly into like the specific steps or the specific thing that you're saying to do, without first giving like the high level strategic context of why that stuff matters.
Okay, I understand, and I agree with you completely.
Awesome.
Thank you.